Welcome to the Graduated Thoughts podcast.
Welcome to the debate. You know, back in 1946, a psychoanalyst named Dr. Helen McLean discovered something genuinely terrifying.
Terrifying, but honestly not at all surprising if you know the history.
Right. She found that the very act of being polite, of constantly modulating oneself, was literally giving Black Americans heart attacks.
Yeah, it is a staggering physiological reality. She documented how the constant need to suppress chronic, justified rage just to maintain what she called white comfort led directly to devastating cardiovascular disease. I mean, the body keeps a score.
It absolutely does. And that brings us to what we are looking at today, which is the utility and the direction of Black rage. And we need to be very clear about the baseline of this conversation right from the start.
Yes, absolutely.
We're not debating the existence or, the legitimacy of this rage. When you look at 400 years of active, ongoing, systemic trauma, that rage is an entirely rational biological and psychological inheritance. We refuse to apologize for it.
Completely agree. The legitimacy is not up for debate.
Right. So the debate today centers entirely on a single question. What do we do with the fire?
And that question, frankly, is a matter of literal survival. We are grounding our discussion today in the sociological and psychological frameworks of Dr. Amos Wilson's text, Black on Black Violence, EBSCO's clinical research on Stockholm Syndrome, the modern unlearning and addressing anti-Blackness curriculum, and of course, the 1965 Moynihan Report.
I'll just go ahead and put my position on the table. Black rage is a profound, justified political inheritance. And any modern demands to soften it, to channel it, or transform it into something quote-unquote productive are themselves a form of the psychological conditioning described in the Stockholm Syndrome literature.
Okay, so you see it as capitulation.
Yes, exactly. It is an attempt to make our resistance digestible for the very system that caused the trauma in the first place.
Well, my perspective comes from a slightly different angle. I agree that rage is the vital engine of resistance, but without structural channeling, specifically the kind of rigorous framework proposed in the Unlearning Anti-Blackness curriculum, raw rage inevitably devolves into the devastating intra-community violence that Dr. Amos Wilson diagnosed.
You're saying it turns inward.
Right. It becomes a tool of self-destruction rather than liberation.
So if we want to understand where this modern obsession with managing Black emotion actually comes from, I think we have to look at the 1965 Moynihan Report.
The root of the pathology argument.
Precisely. That document is the historical artifact that really cemented a deeply flawed white sociological framework. Moynihan took an entirely rational reaction to Holocaust-level systemic terror, and he labeled it a tangle of pathology.
Yeah.
He obsessed over family structures and essentially categorized the community's alienation as aberrant, inadequate, or antisocial behavior.
Moynihan essentially shifted the entire sociological lens, He moved it away from the violence of the state and focused it entirely on the coping mechanisms of the victims.
Exactly that. He framed the victim's response to systemic terror as the primary source of the community's weakness. So, if you're listening to this and wondering why society is so utterly obsessed with making Black rage productive, it traces directly back to this pathology. My argument here is that when we demand that Black people structure their rage into neat, organized programs or curriculums, we are just continuing Moynihan's work.
I see where you're going, but
It is a demand for compliance masquerading as progress. We are taking the fire and trying to put it in a box so it doesn't make the dominant culture nervous.
But you are assuming that structuring rage inherently means making it polite for a white audience. And I think we need to separate Moynihan from the very real, practical mechanics of community survival.
How do we separate them when the demand is the same?
Because the intent is entirely different. Look, the Moynihan Report was undeniably toxic. I mean, it relied on deeply twisted comparisons of the Black family under slavery to the Sambo caricature of prisoners in Nazi concentration camps. It was grotesque.
It completely stripped away the unique historical context. Yeah.
Completely stripped it away. But acknowledging the destructive potential of raw, unmediated rage is not pathologizing it. It is just observing reality.
But how is it not pathologizing it? When you tell a community that their unfiltered anger is a danger that needs a curriculum to fix it, you are treating the anger as the disease. You are accepting Moynihan's premise that our behavior is the problem to be solved.
I am looking at the bodies in our own streets. That is the reality. Let's bring in Dr. Amos Wilson's Black on Black violence.
Okay, let's look at Wilson. He works in Wilson's framework for those who might not be familiar.
Sure. It's fundamentally about perceived power, the systemic dominance of the state, the police, the courts, the economic structures, is so overwhelming that the oppressor is perceived as essentially invincible.
Right. A direct attack is suicidal.
Exactly. Because the direct attack on the state usually results in imprisonment or death. So the frustrated, enraged individual doesn't attack the source of their pain. Instead, the anger travels down the path of least resistance.
It hits whoever is closest.
Yes. The individual cathartically redirects their hostility toward innocent people within their own group. They attack a less dangerous target. So when I advocate for structural channeling, I am not asking anyone to be polite. I am pointing out that without a structure to direct that fire outward, it burns down our own house.
I hear that. But look at how you're proposing we direct that fire outward. You want to use societal structures, academic frameworks, curriculums to manage it. Let's pull in the EBSCO clinical research on Stockholm Syndrome.
All right.
The fundamental mechanism of Stockholm Syndrome isn't just, a hostage falling in love with a bank robber like in the movies. It develops under very specific conditions: prolonged captivity, intense power disparities, isolation, and when the captive relies on the captor for basic survival.
Which, frankly, accurately describes the macro environment of Black Americans for 4 centuries.
Yes, perfectly. And the key survival strategy in that syndrome is the captor adopting the sympathetic attitudes and the beliefs of the captor. Why? To avoid the paralyzing severe anxiety of constant unfiltered resistance.
Okay, but how does that apply to a pedagogy of liberation?
Because if you take this profound, justified generational rage and you attempt to channel it so that it is less disruptive to the oppressive system, you are psychologically bonding with the captor. You are policing your own behavior to keep the peace.
I wouldn't call organizing the political response keeping the peace.
But the rage is an inheritance precisely because it is the only authentic, unconditioned response we have left. The moment you quote-unquote structure it through an academic curriculum, you dilute it into something the dominant culture can digest.
See, you are framing structural channeling as capitulation. But let me ask you this. Isn't unchanneled, explosive rage actually doing the oppressor's work for them?
How so?
Let's talk about Wilson's concept of introjection.
The idea of absorbing the oppressor's values?
Right. Introjection is the psychological process where a weaker party incorporates the values and attitudes of a more powerful party. Wilson explicitly explains that under a white supremacist system, the Black-on-Black criminal is unwittingly acting out the introjected white racist spirit.
So they are adopting the anti-Blackness of the state.
Exactly. He destroys substitute Black victims because he has adopted the oppressor's contempt for Black life. He values his neighbor's life as little as the state does.
So you are saying the street-level violence is a direct manifestation of the oppressor's mindset?
Yes. So when we see this raw, explosive, unchanneled rage playing out as violence in the streets, that isn't resistance. That is the ultimate capitulation. That is Stockholm Syndrome in its most lethal form, where the victim literally does the captor's killing for them.
Wow.
So how can you look at someone acting as the oppressor's proxy and call that a political inheritance?
Well, if you are listening to this and thinking, well, obviously we need programs to stop gang violence, you have to look at what those programs actually ask of the participants physiologically.
Okay, let's talk physiology.
You are focusing on the behavioral output of the rage, the street violence, but we have to look at the physical toll of containing and redirecting that rage. Let's go back to Dr. Helen McLean's hypertension research.
The psychosomatic data on cardiovascular disease we mentioned earlier.
Right. It's more than just data, It is the biological mechanism of suppression. When you force a community to constantly police their own tone, to manage their trauma, to neatly package their anger into a 12-week pedagogical strategy so they don't seem like an immediate threat, you keep cortisol levels perpetually elevated.
The stress doesn't just go away.
No, it doesn't. The autonomic nervous system is locked in a fight-or-flight response that is never allowed to resolve. The body is under constant assault. When a community is forced to systematically channel 400 years of active, ongoing trauma, it literally destroys them from the inside out.
Look, I am not disputing the lethality of suppressed rage. The physical toll of internalizing that hostility is a tragedy of epidemic proportions. We agree on that.
So let me offer an analogy to explain why this demand for structure is so insidious.
Go ahead.
Requiring us to systematize our rage is like telling someone trapped in a burning building to carefully structure their panic so they don't disturb the arsonist. It is absurd. The raw expression of rage, the absolute refusal to modulate it or make it strategic at every single waking moment, is a biological and spiritual necessity. Modulating it destroys the body.
That burning building analogy is incredibly evocative. It really is. But it assumes that channeling is the exact same thing as suppressing. And it isn't.
I mean, functionally, it often plays out the same way.
Not in this framework. To use your analogy, I am not telling the person in the burning building to suppress their panic. I am handing them an axe and showing them exactly which load-bearing wall to swing at to bring the house down on the arsonist.
An axe in the form of an academic program?
A rigorous 12-week program, yes. The Unlearning and Addressing Anti-Blackness curriculum explicitly exists to evaluate those very psychosomatic effects you just mentioned. It exists to disrupt the cultural agreements of white supremacy.
But it's still pedagogical.
When the curriculum talks about Afrocentric pedagogic theory, it is not talking about making kids sit quietly at desks and learn respectability politics. It is actively mapping out the somatic responses to racism and retraining the nervous system to direct that energy strategically.
Toward the oppressor.
Exactly. It means educating the youth to legitimize their human potential and to train them in tasks diametrically opposed to white American interests. It is highly intentional. If we just let the rage out without a track, it just bleeds into the streets as domestic homicide or gang violence. That doesn't strike the arsonist. It just helps the fire consume the other victims trapped in the building.
I hear your point. But in setting up those tracks, in creating these meticulous 12-week unlearning curriculums, you are still operating under a paradigm that places the burden of education and restructuring squarely on the victims. Well, we are the ones sitting in the seminars. We are the ones doing the emotional labor, managing our trauma, and, mapping out pedagogical strategies. Meanwhile, the psychopathic systems that created the conditions in the first place remain completely insulated. They don't have to change at all.
The asymmetry of the burden is profoundly unfair. Yes, I won't argue that.
It is more than unfair. It is a distraction. By constantly centering our discourse on how we must fix or channel the behavior of Black folks, we are quietly agreeing with Moynihan's fundamental premise. We are agreeing that Black behavior is the variable that needs adjusting.
But ignoring it doesn't make us safer.
True liberation means rejecting the idea that our rage needs to be made presentable or even organized to be valid.
But refusing to address intra-community violence just out of spite for Moynihan's racist framing leaves the community totally vulnerable. It leaves us open to exactly what Wilson calls self-annihilation in service of white domination.
I'm not saying we ignore violence.
But if we romanticize raw rage as this untouchable inheritance, we ignore Wilson's warning that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. We cannot let our righteous anger over sociological asymmetry blind us to the bodies in our own communities. We just allow the oppressor to maintain control without lifting a finger.
But when we intensely police our own rage, demanding it only take the form of structured pedagogy, we are acting like the captive keeping the peace so the captor doesn't get angry. Let's look at history. Look at the Watts uprisings or, the unrest in Newark and Detroit.
You are talking about the riots.
I am talking about raw, unchanneled, explosive rage. And it forced a societal reckoning. It caused an immediate shift in the political landscape that no 12-week polite curriculum ever could.
Did it, though?
When the captive begins to police their own behavior and the behavior of their fellow captives just to ensure the captor feels safe, that is Stockholm Syndrome. We are saying, oh, don't express your anger that way. It's not productive. It's not the right kind of resistance. We simply do not have the luxury of dictating the purity of the fire.
A riot is a temporary release of pressure. It is a spark. It is not a sustained transfer of power. And Wilson is very, very clear on the mechanics of this.
What does he say?
The system expects the explosion. It anticipates it. It isolates the explosion. It contains it. And then, crucially, it uses the aftermath of the explosion to justify an influx of federal funding for police.
The crackdown.
Exactly. Further militarization, heavier surveillance. The material gains for the community are almost always negligible compared to the draconian crackdowns that immediately follow.
So you believe the raw outburst actually strengthens the state in the long run?
The system feeds on that raw outburst. It points to the unrest and says, look, Moynihan was right. They are aberrant and antisocial. Send in the National Guard. My conclusion remains that rage is the vital engine of resistance. It is the fuel. But without the intentional, structural track provided by deep, unapologetic Afrocentric education, that engine derails. We must use our intellect and our historical awareness to build a containment field for that rage.
A containment field.
Not to suppress it, and certainly not to keep the captor comfortable, but to turn the fire into a laser that can actually cut through the bars of the cage. Because if we don't, we are just detonating a bomb inside our own cells.
The tension between honoring the sheer magnitude of raw generational trauma and meticulously focusing it for collective survival is an incredibly difficult burden. If you're listening, you can hear the agonizing weight of this choice.
You really can.
Do you honor the authentic biological response to trauma, or do you suppress the immediate instinct in favor of a long-term strategic strike?
It is the heaviest burden imaginable. And I think, despite our profound disagreement today on the application of the rage, we are completely unified in our rejection of the Moynihan Report's pathologizing framework. We know the sickness lies in the system, not in the response to the system.
Absolutely. The pathology is white supremacy. The pathology is the anti-Black terror that necessitated the rage in the first place. The burden of navigating the fallout of that terror is monumental. And society constantly demands that the victims clean up the mess.
Right. The victims are forced to become the architects of their own rescue, while the arsonists sit back and critique the blueprints.
That's a powerful way to put it, and perhaps that is the ultimate takeaway here. The very fact that we are having this rigorous intellectual struggle, this agonizing debate over how to survive, how to resist, and how to conquer, is itself the inheritance.
Yeah. The intellect applied to the survival of the community is the inheritance.
The struggle to figure out the right path forward is proof that the fire hasn't gone out. So we leave you, the listener, to contemplate the true utility of this rage. Think back to that burning inheritance. When a fire has been burning for 400 years, do you try to build a forge to harness its heat? Or do you finally just let it burn the whole house down?
Hey there, glad you stopped by. If you're feeling the vibe, stick around for a little while. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Like and subscribe.